Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and because I felt like it, we're back with the Elemental Masters series by Mercedes Lackey. And again, I won't be reading these books in any particular order. This one is, in particular, the fairy tale for this one, because as I have mentioned before, the Elemental Masters series is very much fairy tales, then put into this historical fantasy turn of the last century setting. This one is very much Cinderella. The fire mage in this case is Ellie, who the thing about her is that her wicked stepmother is an evil earth mage. And Eleanor Robinson, rather, is basically, what happens with her is that when her father gets sent away to the front and dies on the front because he was old enough to go to war, or rather was young enough to still go to war, that her wicked stepmother, Allison, uses magic to effectively bind Eleanor into place. Because the thing is that it's now the 19-teens. And so this particular Cinderella is not in the same position that an 18th century Cinderella would be, where she would have absolutely no options. This one, she probably would have been able to find her way to somewhere, to some sort of escape, and more than that, because the will had left everything to her, because Allison had forgotten to get her seduced husband to change his will, they had to keep her alive in order to continue having access to the money. And so what you have in this is they keep Eleanor alive, convince everybody that she has gone away to Oxford, and in the meantime they use her as a skivvy, as a maid about, as a general labor and maid, and so on and so forth. And Eleanor goes through a couple years where she's basically trapped and despairing. The thing is that her first inkling that magic exists is when her stepmother, that she hears her father is dead, and her stepmother basically grabs her, drags her down to in front of the fire, and literally chops off part of one of her fingers and buries it under a flagstone in front of the fire, and uses that to bind Eleanor to the hearth and the home. And so for a couple of years, Eleanor literally cannot physically stir outside of the home. She cannot do, there's a lot of things that she simply can't do without her stepmother's specific spoken verbal permission. And so you have that. Her handsome prince, in the meantime, is one of the local peerage. That Reggie is, that his father is a peer. I don't recall offhand because I wasn't really paying attention to that on this particular reread. Was an earl or something, and he went to the front as a pilot. I mean, he's an airmaster, so being a pilot is a natural step. But the interesting thing about him is that he winds up suffering from sort of a tripled PTSD, what they called shell shock back in the day. Because shell shock was a more or less technical term at the time for what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That is, you have been through an incredibly traumatic series of events and you suffer from the after effects, periods of time where you suddenly are sunk into a sense of unbearable fear of absolutely nothing, but you're just absolutely sure that something bad is about to happen to you and you hide under a table. Getting the shakes because you're remembering horrible things that happened, flashbacks, the stuff that comes with that. And it is one of Mercedes Lackey's points of discussion in this book. One of the things that happens is, in fact, a primary issue that came with World War I, because World War I, it's not that, PTSD wouldn't have existed before then. But World War I was the first time you had a war that was quite as massive in scale and as horrific as this. Because, of course, World War I basically ate up all of Europe. Like, the entirety of Europe was like one giant war front, up and down and all over. And on top of that, of course, you had the Canadians there and the Australians and eventually the Americans, and you had a front that was like all the way down in Africa, and it was a massive wide-ranging, big-scale undertaking. And you had brand new weapons in this war that completely obviated previous things. Mercedes Lackey has a scene in this where one of the cavalry was talking about how this was a terrible waste of horse flesh, because you would have somebody on a horse and they would just get mowed down by the relatively brand new invention of the machine gun. There was no point in a horse, because you ride a horse and the machine gun just cuts you down, no trouble. You can't use a horse to break a line, because they can take out your horse without any sort of issue whatsoever, in a way that a hail of arrows, for example, wouldn't have been able to. And so you have that. You have tanks, which are a whole brand new thing. You have the invention of chemical warfare in a way that had never been seen before. Some of that impetus that comes up behind, the eventual Geneva Convention was having all of these things where they would throw gas at people and just cause horrific results. And so you had people leaving the front who were mentally and physically shattered in ways that had not happened before, and certainly had not happened on that scale before. And they would come home to people who had never been in a traumatic situation like that, and people would stand around and insist that they were malingering. That, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have a busted leg. You don't have a broken arm. You don't have anything. You're just hiding under a table for no reason. And there were a lot of people who thought that shell shock was just a pretty fiction made up by soldiers who didn't want to get back on their feet and go back to doing their jobs. Most of these people, of course, were people who had never been on a war front for any extended period of time. But Reggie comes back and he is absolutely suffering from shell shock, because what happened was his plane crashed and he got buried alive inside of his plane. And then on top of all of the horror of that, he got attacked by evil earth elementals, because, of course, the front lines of a war are going to call up, magical creatures that feed on death and despair and blood and horror and stuff. And them being earth creatures and him being an air master, they were like, oh, look, this is one of those guys we really like to eat. And so he's basically been hit with the shell shock of plane crash and being buried alive and watching people he cares about die. And after all of that, he has also been hit up with being tormented by, earth elementals. So he's in bad shape mentally, and his saving grace in a way is the fact that he decides to hide from magic, that he puts up big, massive walls and shields himself to hell and gone, to the point where nobody can even tell that he is magical. And the thing about doing that is, while it means you can't see or hear any magic, it does also consequently mean that you basically, magic just kind of bounces off you. You can't use it, you can't see things that are happening that you would otherwise be able to see, but you're also not going to be affected by magic spells that are meant to seduce, and so he's able to avoid being pulled in by the wicked stepmother and her daughters. Lackey actually pulls from the original grim fairy tale of Cinderella for this at the end, because, as I said at the start, Allison, the stepmother, chopped off Eleanor's finger. And at the very end, rather than in the original fairy tale, or one of the variants of the original fairy tale, one of the wicked stepsisters, in a desperate bid to fit her feet into the little tiny glass slipper, or fur slipper in the original French, in a desperate bid to fit her foot into that slipper, chops off parts of her feet, like cuts off her heel and her toes, and is thus able to stick her foot into the slipper, and they almost cart her off until they look and realize that she's bleeding all over it because her foot didn't actually fit the slipper. She cut off parts of her feet to do it. Well, Eleanor goes to the ball, because there is a ball. She makes her way to the ball because she basically, in a desperate bid to find an heir master, because she's been informed that the peers, whatever, who live in that house are an heir master family. So she was hoping to find one that would help free her from Allison's grasp. When things fall apart, but she winds up leaving behind a glove, and it's a glove with a missing finger. And so Reggie shows up and he says, "I'm looking for Eleanor, and I know this is hers because it's missing a finger." And Allison, being the kind of person that she is, grabs one of her daughters and chops off that daughter's finger, and probably, just cauterizes the wound so that her daughter can fit her hand into the glove. And it's a deliberate use of the fairy tale, which, is incredibly grisly, but yeah. Anyway, so this is an interesting one, because it really, really places itself in its moment. But at the same time, you have Mercedes Lackey's very modern perspective informing things, the characters who are willing to believe that this psychotherapy stuff is real and valid, that, shell shock is valid. The questions about, why aren't the poor people of the village rising up and overthrowing the wealthy, because class, especially going into World War I, was an incredibly divisive thing. Class lines were incredibly difficult to cross, and it was the kind of thing that took a lot of money and a lot of money or a lot of will, or a combination of the two, to cross. Now, it had been happening more at the time, as Reggie points out in this book, when you would have the peerage, these titled people who have no money left, who are willing to sort of sacrifice themselves on the altar of an extremely rich nouveau riche American, but that was crossing a line with a large amount of money. So, this is a book that's sort of, it's very much about that balancing on a knife's edge that was happening at the turn of the century, that kind of went into remission during the 20s and 30s because, everybody got back from war and was just so tired that they didn't want to deal with it. But World War I was that first, it was one of those first big, real populist moves of the 20th century. And yeah, I'm not going to explain that properly because I'm running out of time, and yeah. So that's all I'm going to say, and I will see you all next week.